Thank you, Madam Speaker. I, of course, rise today to speak on Bill C-74, the Budget Implementation Bill. A daunting task given the bill's over 500 pages and the fact that it amends 44 pieces of legislation. An omnibus bill, for sure, which is unfortunate in and of itself. But even more unfortunate is that the bill doesn't include all the things that the government put forward in the budget. And just prior to getting up to give my speech, I made a comment on the fact that pay equity legislation wasn't included, and we have no dollars put in the budget to actually implement that pay equity legislation, should we hope that it eventually comes. This disappointment, this is disappointing, of course, and the bill, for me, misses bringing a lot more needed change to address the inequity in people's lives, to ensure the change that everyone pays their fair share of taxes, and of course the change we need to build an economy that is working for everyone and not just a few. Childcare, housing, and affordable prescription medication. Madam Speaker, these are three issues. These three issues are what my constituents in Saskatoon West see as in need of real change, real fast. These same issues, childcare, housing, and affordable prescription medication, are issues I raised in my very first speech as an elected member of Parliament. And three budgets later, I'm still raising these issues, and those I represent are still waiting for the promised change. Many in my riding had high hopes that this Liberal government, given the promises on the campaign trail, would have moved the needle substantially by this point in their mandate on all three issues. So let's start with childcare, for example. First, there are zero new dollars for childcare in this budget. And to date, I would say this government's investment in childcare has been more symbolic than anything. It is not a priority for this government. If it was, then three budgets later, we would not have to be talking about the lack of affordable and accessible childcare. In December of last year, I had the honour of meeting with an extraordinary group of women. They were participants in the Trade Journey program at the YWCA in Saskatoon. The Trade Journey program is a bridging program for women who are seeking a career in one of three trades: carpentry, plumbing, or electrical. I was invited and asked to share some of my tips and, dare I say, survival skills for working in a male-dominated profession. My workplace was obviously politics, and their soon-to-be workplaces would be in the skilled trades. As often is the case, I find myself just so impressed, so in awe of these women's determination and their tenacity in face of both personal challenges, but also the institutional challenges of sexism and racism. And as with almost 99.999% of the conversations I have with women in my riding, the conversation turned to childcare. And they were emphatic of the need for and the importance of affordable, accessible childcare to their success as journey persons. They just couldn't understand why the government didn't understand how critical childcare was to their success in the workplace and to the health and well-being of themselves and their families. And I agreed with them. And I really didn't have an answer for them as to why, regardless of what political parties in power, women continue to have to fight for childcare. And the fight continues as we see once again a federal government paying lip service to one, if not the social policy that would improve the lives of so many women in our country and really increase the productivity of this country as a whole. A truly feminist government would understand this and by now would have invested what was needed to bring about real change for women. Let me turn to affordable prescription medication. Almost 1 million Canadians give up food and heat to afford prescriptions in Canada. Affordable prescription medication is key to the health and well-being of all Canadians and to a sustainable universal health care system, and to the people in my riding of Saskatoon West. In conversation with older adults in my riding, the high cost of medication always comes up. It's raised because of the challenges of living on fixed income, and with that, the challenges to maintain a home or an apartment, to be able to pay rent or mortgage, and to pay for medication. And what happens, as what was documented in a recent study, Because of the unaffordability of medication, people get sick, they stay sick, and they end up going to the doctor for multiple visits and, of course, in some cases, even ending up in the hospital. More than 1.6 million Canadians, just over 8% of people prescribed medication in Canada, didn't fill their prescriptions or skipped doses because they couldn't afford it. And in a riding with the median income below $40,000 a year, I represent a lot of people who are doing just that, skipping doses or not filling prescriptions at all. The UBC study that surveyed over 28,000 people found that people without insurance, lower income people, and young people were more likely to struggle to afford medication. Women were twice as likely as men to report they struggled to afford medication, as were Indigenous people. Canada is the only country with a universal health care system that doesn't include free access to prescription medication. It's time, Madam Speaker, after studying the issue to death by governments, by researchers, pardon the pun, by parliaments, to stop kicking the proverbial can down the road. I'd like to use a phrase made famous by a certain shoe company: let's just do it. But instead, what we're going to do is study it again and offer ourselves further advice. It's time this government moved from the hope to the hard work of farmer care. The only people benefiting from yet again more talk and more consultation and no action are the pharmaceutical companies, who continue to gouge Canadians and the healthcare system. Canadians pay some of the highest drug costs in the world. If right now Canadians were paying the average, even just the average prescription drug costs of OECD countries, we would have paid $3.6 billion last year. Instead, we paid $13.7 billion. Madam Speaker, that's a lot of home care services. That's a lot of money to address the crisis in mental health for young people. Most of us are tired of hoping and wishing for the day of universal prescription drug plan for all Canadians. It's time to stop giving excuses and start the work of implementing pharmacare in this country. My final comments on the trifecta of challenges my folks in my riding are facing is on housing. Last November, the hotly anticipated National Housing Strategy was released. But in the Budget Implementation Act, we see no new legislation. The Prime Minister clearly stated at the launch of the National Housing Strategy that housing rights are human rights. But instead of legislation and debate on a bill to legislate the right to housing, we continue with consultation. I believe we need much more hard work on this file. We need more specifics. We need the promised new investment now, not years down the road, and not certainly after the next federal election. Let me elaborate a bit. The $40 billion plus of planned spending connected to the National Housing Strategy over the next 10 years only budgets $11.2 billion of new money. The rest of the funding envelope is a rearranging of current programs, loan funding, and of course the important matching funding from the provinces and territories. The government's response to what for many is a crisis in affordability and in the rising number of people living on the street just isn't good enough. We have a minimal investment of new dollars. The largest allocation of new investment comes 3 years down the road, and we have a huge 10-year horizon for the investment. The speed and the amount of the investment doesn't match the urgency faced by many communities, including my own. When we look at the amount of investment specifically focused on those Canadians with no roof over their head, and the target number of reducing the number of Canadians who are homeless by 50% over 10 years, we don't see a government with the resources or the plan in place to truly recognize housing as a human right. We know the growing number of Canadians living on the street without safety and security of a place to call home are often young people. And a large number of those young people are young people who have aged out of the foster care system and are LGBTQ youth. We must speed up the investment. We must set more aggressive targets. We must work harder and set a much more courageous timeline if we are to make a difference in the lives of these young Canadians. We are still waiting for a separate strategy for Indigenous people living in urban centres. We saw a very modest amount of funding in a previous budget, but no detail. Oh, sorry, Madam Speaker, I didn't realize I'd run out of time.
Perfect. Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Services.
It's always good to hear from my colleague from Saskatchewan. I think we share priorities in terms of childcare, affordable housing, and pharmacare. On the issue of childcare, it's not this budget she should look to, but the budget of 2016, which invested $7.5 billion over the next 10 years. Those accords have been signed with the provinces. That money is being spent in my province. 100,000 new regulated daycare spaces are being funded as a direct result of that budget. On the issue of pharmacare, I agree it's not being implemented immediately. There is a strategic plan that's being produced by a panel of experts that will show us exactly how to do that, and I invite her to be standing in this House next year when we do just that in terms of acting on those recommendations. But on the issue of affordable housing, I am gobsmacked. I remind the member opposite, her party only promised $40 million for homelessness over 4 years, $10 million extra a year. In our very first budget, we spent $100 million more than the previous year. So we doubled it from $100 to $200 million, which means we're going to be spending $400 million in homelessness over the 4 years of our term of office, not the paltry, meek, timid $40 million promised by her government. But where it really gets me is she says there's no new money for housing in this budget. There's close to $2 billion new for rental housing in this budget. And if you look at her platform in the previous election, the final 3 years of their mandate, 0, 0, 0, 0. That's the NDP platform that they think we should follow as bold advice. Is she really serious that no money is being spent, or is she just pretending that no money is being spent to make a political argument?
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I guess I'll thank my honourable colleague across the way for his comments, although he didn't quite reflect exactly what I said. What I had talked about is that the majority of the new investment into housing is coming after the next federal election. That over the $40 billion that I've heard my honourable colleague repeat over and over, that only $11 billion is new investment. And I'm not denying that the government isn't looking at rearranging programs. We're going to hopefully hear this next week, some of the details, and maybe they will be an improvement. But my point was that from my perspective as a Member of Parliament and from my work I've done in housing and homelessness, it's not enough money. It's coming much too late. The largest investment is after the next federal election, and I think we could do better. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Speaker. And I'm seeing this recurring theme with the NDP. Whenever we bring forward a piece of legislation or proposition, it's always, why aren't you doing it faster? You know, with respect to cannabis, why aren't you doing this faster? With respect to pharmacare, why aren't you doing this faster? And, you know, the reality of the situation is, Madam Speaker, that these things take time, and it takes time to properly plan this so that it's executed correctly. But I do take issue with her comments with respect to childcare. The truth of the matter is when this party came into government, we changed the rules with the CCB. We created a new program where 9 out of 10 families get more money for children now. This particular budget goes on to strengthen that. An individual, a single parent that's making $35,000 a year will now see an additional $560 a year for to help with their children's expenses. I'm wondering, you know, why, how she can actually bring herself later on today to vote against this when we're actually doing real solid things for children and for families that have children.
Good question.
The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Well, I guess, Madam Speaker, what I'm saying is there's not enough here in this omnibus budget for the residents in my riding, in particular for those women I met at the Trade Journey program. I'm not denying that Canada Child Benefit has helped people, but it doesn't matter the program that comes if there is no access to affordable universal child care. It wasn't going to be helpful for these women. They weren't saying they weren't appreciative of the Canada Child Benefit. They were saying what they wanted and what they needed was universal affordable child care. And what they said to me is, why don't governments understand that, and why has it taken so long for childcare to be a priority for governments at the same priority level as other things. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming